A shadow in the classroom. The soft hum of chatter filled the halls of Maple Ridge Middle School, a place where the biggest worries usually revolved around pop quizzes, lost homework, and whether someone's lunch trade was worth it. The new kid, however, stood in stark contrast to the normal rhythm of the school. Noah Pierce arrived 3 weeks into the spring semester, slipping through the main doors with a tattered backpack, shoes that had seen far too many seasons, and a silence that clung to him like an oversized shadow. He was 12, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made him seem smaller. Shoulders drawn in, head slightly lowered, eyes darting from side to side, as though bracing for something no one else could see. Mr. Ethan Simmons first noticed the boy during morning homeroom, when Noah shuffled to the back-cornered desk without a word. The school's policy was to introduce new students at the start of class, but Noah's wide eyes and trembling hands made Mr. Simmons hesitate. Instead, the teacher simply welcomed him with a warm smile and moved on, noting the way Noah flinched when someone accidentally bumped his chair. The first week passed with barely a whisper from the boy. He completed his assignments with meticulous care, his handwriting almost painfully neat. He never raised his hand, never asked for help, never made a sound unless directly spoken to. Even then, his responses were clipped and quiet, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. It was during gym class that Mr. Simmons noticed the first bruise. The students were changing into their PE uniforms, and as Noah pushed up the sleeve of his too large sweatshirt, a deep purple mark wrapped around his forearm, as though a hand had clamped down and refused to let go. Mr. Simmons asked about it, keeping his tone gentle, his face carefully neutral. Noah's response was immediate. "Fell off my bike," he mumbled, eyes locked on his sneakers. It was plausible. Kids fell off bikes all the time. But something about the explanation, the rehearsed swiftness of it, gnawed at the edges of Mr. Simmons's mind. Still, there was nothing concrete. A single bruise. An anxious boy. It could be nothing. Teachers knew better than to assume the worst every time they saw a scratch or scrape. But Ethan Simmons wasn't just any teacher. He'd been that boy once, the one who flinched too easily, who lied too smoothly about why his ribs hurt, who smiled too widely when adults asked if everything was okay. He filed it away, but his eyes never left Noah. The bruises multiplied. First on his wrist, then the back of his shoulder, then a faint one across the side of his neck, just barely peeking out above the collar of his shirt. Each one came with a new excuse: tripping on the stairs, bumping into a door, an overly competitive game of basketball no one remembered playing. It was Olivia Martins who first broke through Noah's silence. She wasn't the loudest kid in class, but she had a warmth about her, a soft, steady presence that made people feel comfortable. She noticed Noah sitting alone at lunch, the way he picked at his food, always choosing the smallest bites, folding his sandwich in half as though trying to make it last longer. "Hey," she said one afternoon, sliding into the seat across from him. "You want some chips?" Noah's eyes flicked up, startled, then back down to his tray. His fingers tightened around the edge. "I made him," she added. "Kind of a family thing." She pushed the small paper bag toward him, and after a long hesitation, he took it. The whispered thank you was so quiet she almost missed it. From then on, Olivia made a point to sit near him, offering small tokens of kindness, a cookie from her lunchbox, a new pencil when she saw him chewing on the same one for days, a spot beside her in group projects. He never talked much, but the tiny, flickering smiles she earned made her keep trying. The real turning point came on a cold Tuesday morning. It was raining outside, and the students had been corralled into the gym for indoor recess. Noah sat by the bleachers, hunched over his sketchbook, shading something with furious concentration. Mr. Simmons walked by, casually peeking over his shoulder. The drawing was unsettling. It showed a small figure curled in a ball, knees to chest, while shadowy hands loomed above, fingers claw-like, and stretched unnaturally long. The hands surrounded the figure, pressing in on all sides. Noah's pencil pressed so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Mr. Simmons asked softly. Noah slammed the sketchbook shut, cradling it against his chest like a shield. "Nothing," he muttered. That night, Mr. Simmons couldn't sleep. The memories came back, sharper than they had in years. The weight of his own foster father's hand on his neck, the cold press of the basement floor when he was thrown down there for crying, the desperate, useless hope that someone, anyone, would notice. He arrived early the next morning and left a note on Mrs. Anderson's desk. "Need to talk about Noah Pierce. I have a bad feeling." Mrs. Sarah Anderson had been the school counselor for over a decade, with a sixth sense for students hiding pain behind polite smiles. She called Noah in for a new student check-in, keeping her tone light and non-threatening. They talked about his favorite subjects, science, his least favorite, PE, and whether he liked Maple Ridge so far. It's okay. When she asked about his foster parents, Martin and Rebecca, Noah's answers became even shorter. "They're nice," he said, voice wooden. "Do you feel safe at home, Noah?" Mrs. Anderson asked gently. Noah's head bobbed in a quick, mechanical nod. Yes. But his hands were trembling, knuckles white where they gripped the hem of his sleeve. "Okay," she said softly. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm always here." The moment he left her office, Mrs. Anderson's stomach twisted with unease. She knew that posture, that brittle politeness. It was survival. Over the next week, the school's concern grew into a quiet storm. Whispers in the faculty lounge, exchanged glances between teachers when Noah walked past. Then Miss Paddle found him crying outside the boys' bathroom, shaking so hard his teeth chattered. When she asked what was wrong, he wiped his face roughly and said, "Nothing, please." They were running out of time. Mr. Simmons was grading papers when Noah lingered by his desk after class. The room was empty, rain tapping against the windows, and the boy's hands were crumpled into fists at his sides. "Mr. Simmons," he said in a voice so soft it barely reached the teacher's ears. "Yeah, buddy." The boy's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His eyes were glassy, darting to the door and back again. Finally, he whispered 3 words, each one cutting through the silence like a blade. "They hurt me." For a moment, Mr. Simmons couldn't breathe. Those words, those exact words, had once been his own. 12 years old, standing in a different school office, whispering the truth to a teacher whose name he barely remembered now. But he remembered how it felt. The terror, the shame, the fragile, desperate hope. He knelt beside Noah, keeping his voice steady. "It's okay, buddy. We're going to help you." Tears spilled over Noah's cheeks as his small, trembling hands found the edge of Mr. Simmons's sleeve, clutching tight as though it were a lifeline. And for the first time, someone held on. The weight of secrets. The rain had turned to a soft mist by the time Noah left Mr. Simmons's classroom, his feet shuffling down the empty hallway like they were weighed down by invisible chains. He had said the words, the ones he'd been told would destroy everything if they ever slipped out. "They hurt me." They were only 3 words, but they echoed inside him like an earthquake, rattling loose the fragile foundation he'd built to survive. He had never expected to say them out loud, not to anyone, and especially not to someone like Mr. Simmons, a teacher who seemed too kind, too safe, too unreal. What had he done? Would Martin and Rebecca find out? Would they come to school, pull him out, and drag him home, where no one could hear him scream? He couldn't let himself think about that. Not yet. Mr. Simmons sat frozen at his desk long after Noah had gone. His hands trembled faintly as they rested on the pile of ungraded essays. He wasn't reading them. Couldn't. His mind had flown back to his own childhood. The stale scent of a cigarette dangling from his foster father's mouth, the crack of a belt on bare skin, the taste of blood and salt on his tongue after he dared to speak up once. But Noah wasn't him. This wasn't going to end the same way. He rose from his desk and walked with deliberate steps to Mrs. Anderson's office, the small school counselor's space tucked away in the administrative wing. The door was slightly ajar, and the smell of herbal tea drifted into the hallway. Mrs. Anderson glanced up from her computer, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "Ethan," she said, surprised. "What's wrong?" He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, running a hand through his hair. "It's Noah," he said quietly. "He just told me. They hurt him." The words felt heavy in his throat, heavier than they should have, because they belonged to a small boy with two thin wrists and shadows under his eyes. Mrs. Anderson's face lost its warmth, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Did he say who?" she asked. "No, but it's obvious. It's the Reynolds." Mr. Simmons leaned against the wall, jaw tight. He didn't want to say anything, but it just came out. Mrs. Anderson's hands folded together on her desk, knuckles whitening slightly. "We'll have to report it immediately. It's no longer just suspicion." He nodded. "What can I do?" "Right now," she sighed, the weight of too many similar cases etched into her posture. "Stay close to him. He trusts you. That's rare. If you can keep that door open, we might be able to help him feel safe enough to tell us everything." The word everything sat like a boulder between them. They both knew what it could mean. That afternoon, Noah was pulled from science class and brought to Mrs. Anderson's office again. This time, she had closed the blinds, softened the lights, and set a cup of warm cocoa on the desk, hoping to make the space feel less like an interrogation room. Noah sat perched on the edge of the chair, his knees pressed together, hands clenched in his lap. His eyes darted to the door every few seconds, like a rabbit looking for escape routes. "Noah," Mrs. Anderson said softly, her voice the same gentle tone she used with her own grandchildren. "Mr. Simmons told me a little bit about what you said earlier." Panic flared in Noah's chest, his breath coming faster. His fingers twisted the hem of his hoodie until the fabric strained under his grip. I didn't mean to." His voice was barely above a whisper, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You're not in trouble," Mrs. Anderson assured him quickly. "You're safe here, I promise. No one's going to be mad at you for being honest." He didn't believe that. Not yet. The silence stretched between them until it felt like a third presence in the room, a ghost made of all the words Noah had swallowed down over the years. "Can you tell me what's been happening at home?" she asked gently. He shook his head so quickly it was almost violent. "No," she repeated. "Okay, that's okay." Her easy acceptance confused him. Adults always pushed, demanded answers, pried into things they didn't understand. But she just let the silence sit, filling the room like fog. "I just want you to know," she added after a moment, "that nothing you say will ever be your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." That was what broke him. A thin, broken sob slipped from his throat before he could choke it down. His hands flew to his mouth, but it was too late. The dam had cracked. Tears spilled over his cheeks, his thin shoulders shaking under the weight of too much fear, too many secrets. Mrs. Anderson didn't rush him. She handed him a tissue and waited, her own heart aching for this fragile, terrified boy. It took almost 10 minutes before he could speak again. His voice was so small it was nearly lost in the hum of the heater. "Martin gets mad sometimes," Noah whispered. "I'm not always fast enough, or quiet enough. And if I mess up..." He trailed off, twisting the tissue in his hands until it shredded. Mrs. Anderson leaned forward slightly. "What happens when you mess up?" "He grabs me," Noah said, barely able to force the words out. "Pushes me down sometimes." She wanted to ask more, but his face had gone pale, his breathing too fast. "That's enough for today," she said softly. "You were really brave, Noah. I'm proud of you." He blinked at her, uncomprehending. No one had ever told him that before, not like that. "We're going to make sure you're safe," she added. "You don't have to go through this alone." He wanted to believe her, but the fear was too deeply rooted. Still, some part of him, The tiny part that had dared to whisper those 3 dangerous words to Mr. Simmons wanted her to be right. The call to Child Protective Services was made that afternoon, setting off a chain reaction Noah couldn't fully understand. All he knew was that Martin and Rebecca were going to find out. That thought made him sick to his stomach. Mr. Carter, a seasoned caseworker with tired eyes and a gentle smile, arrived at the school the next day. He asked to speak with Noah, but the boy was too terrified to say much. Mr. Simmons sat beside him the whole time, his steady presence the only thing keeping Noah from bolting out the door. When asked if he wanted to go home that night, Noah's silence was deafening. That was answer enough. Martin Reynolds showed up at the school the following afternoon, his face a carefully controlled mask of concern. He spoke with the principal, insisting that Noah was troubled and prone to exaggeration. He even produced a letter from a family friend attesting to their good parenting. But Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Anderson had already provided CPS with reports of bruises, concerning sketches, and the whispered confession that had set everything in motion. By the time Martin left the school, his smile had twisted into a snarl. "If you're putting ideas in his head," he said to Mr. Simmons, voice low and venomous, "you're going to regret it." Mr. Simmons didn't flinch. "The only thing I regret," he said calmly, "is not asking Noah sooner." The tension between them crackled like a live wire. Noah stood just down the hall, barely peeking out from behind a row of lockers, his heart pounding so loudly he could hardly hear anything else. When Martin's eyes locked on his, a cold spike of terror shot through him. But then Mr. Simmons glanced back, his face calm but resolute, and gave the smallest nod. A promise, silent but unshakable. "I'm here." And for the first time in his life, Noah believed someone might actually mean it. The cracks in the mask. The day after Martin Reynolds stalked out of the school, a strange silence settled over Maple Ridge Middle. It was the kind of silence that comes when adults know something the kids don't. A hushed tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Noah felt it, even if no one said anything directly to him. The glances from teachers lingered just a fraction too long. Olivia's smile felt a little more careful, her voice just a touch softer, and Mr. Simmons, his easy warmth had been replaced with something heavier, like he was constantly standing between Noah and some invisible threat. The tension followed Noah home, or rather, to the house he was still supposed to call home. The moment Noah walked through the front door, Rebecca's syrupy voice filled the air. "There's our little actor," she said, her tone so sweet it made his stomach twist. She stood in the kitchen, hands buried in a mixing bowl, flour dusting the counter like snow. "You had a nice chat at school today, didn't you?" He froze in the doorway, his pulse quickening. Martin was in the living room, the recliner groaning under his weight, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the armrest. "Got a lot to say all of a sudden, huh?" Martin's voice was dangerously calm. "Funny how quiet you can be here." Noah's breath came faster. Every muscle screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed glued to the floor. "Come here," Martin said, without raising his voice. That was always worse than the shouting. The quiet commands meant the mask was on, the perfect foster parent mask that fooled every social worker and neighbor in town. Noah shuffled forward, keeping his eyes down. Martin's hand shot out, gripping Noah's wrist. His fingers pressed into a fading bruise, and Noah couldn't stop the wince. "You told them I hurt you," Martin said softly, his smile thin and sharp. "That was a mistake." "I didn't," Noah whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "You calling me a liar?" Martin's fingers tightened, and Noah's knees buckled slightly. Rebecca kept kneading dough, her back turned, her shoulders tense. "No, sir," Noah said quickly, the words spilling out automatically. Martin released him with a shove. "That's what I thought." Rebecca's voice drifted over from the kitchen. "You know, honey, social services is coming tomorrow for a visit." She glanced over her shoulder, her smile brittle. "We'll all be on our best behavior, won't we?" Noah nodded so hard his neck ached. "Yes, Mom." That night, Noah lay in bed, the darkness pressing against him like a heavy blanket. His rocket ship lamp, the only thing in his room that felt even a little like his, cast weak, flickering light across the walls. Under the mattress, his sketchbook lay hidden, pages filled with twisted shadows and pleading words. The drawings had been his only safe place, the only way to let the fear bleed out onto paper. But now even that felt dangerous. If Martin ever found it, really found it, Noah knew it would be the end. His fingers itched to draw, but instead, he curled into a ball beneath the thin blanket and tried not to cry. The next morning, Rebecca dressed him in his best shirt, a plain white button-up that felt too stiff, too much like a costume. She combed his hair so hard it made his scalp sting, smiling all the while. "You look so handsome," she said, straightening his collar. "Don't you want everyone to see how happy you are here?" Noah forced a nod, his stomach twisting with every word. Mr. Carter from Child Protective Services arrived right after lunch. He was younger than Noah expected, not much older than Mr. Simmons, with kind eyes that didn't quite match the sharpness in the way he asked questions. Martin met him at the door, all warmth and handshakes. The perfect host. Come in," he said. "Would you like some lemonade?" Rebecca just made a fresh batch. Mr. Carter declined, his eyes already scanning the house. Noah sat stiffly on the couch, his hands folded in his lap. His knuckles were white. Rebecca sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on his knee. Just a little too firm, just a little too possessive. "We love Noah like our own," Martin said smoothly, sitting across from them. "It's been such a blessing to have him in our home." Mr. Carter's smile was polite, but his eyes were sharp. "I'd like to speak with Noah privately." Martin's smile didn't waver, but his fingers curled slightly against the armrest. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you need." The small guest bedroom had been hastily cleaned, bed made, toys neatly stacked, as though Noah actually played with them. Mr. Carter sat on the edge of the bed, leaving plenty of space between them. "Noah," he said gently, "I'm here to make sure everything's okay for you at home. You can tell me anything, and you won't get in trouble." Noah's throat felt too tight to speak. He nodded automatically, the same way he always did when adults asked him questions he wasn't allowed to answer. "Do you feel safe here?" Mr. Carter asked. "Yes, sir." "Are Martin and Rebecca kind to you?" "Yes, sir." "Do they ever hurt you?" The pause was just long enough for Mr. Carter to notice. "No, sir," Noah whispered. But his hands were trembling, clutching the hem of his shirt so tightly the fabric twisted in his fingers. Mr. Carter's gaze softened, but he didn't push. "If you ever feel scared or hurt, you can tell me. You're not alone, Noah." Noah nodded again, the words bouncing off the wall around his heart. When Mr. Carter left, Martin's hand clamped onto Noah's shoulder the second the door closed. "Good boy," he said, his breath hot against Noah's ear. "You're learning." Noah forced a smile, the same one he'd worn for years, the one that hid everything, the one that felt like a mask made of glass, ready to shatter with a single crack. At school, Mr. Simmons saw it immediately. The too bright smile, the way Noah's eyes never quite met his, the way his fingers kept curling into the hem of his shirt, even during math class. After dismissal, Mr. Simmons called Mrs. Anderson into his classroom. "They're scaring him into silence," he said, his jaw tight. "He's not going to talk unless he feels absolutely safe." Mrs. Anderson nodded, her own frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. "I'll call CPS again, but without his testimony, it's hard to act." Mr. Simmons stared out the window, watching Noah trudge toward the bus. "We can't wait for him to say it. We have to find proof." That night, Noah sat on his bed, the sketchbook spread across his lap. He drew with frantic urgency, a scene of a small boy trapped in a house where every window was bricked shut, every door locked from the outside. The boy's mouth was open in a scream, but no sound came out. In the corner of the page, he wrote 3 words: Please save me. He didn't hide the sketchbook this time. He left it under his pillow, half exposed, like a flare shot into the sky. The next day, Olivia found him by the lockers. "You okay?" she asked softly, her brow furrowed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Instead, he reached into his backpack, pulled out a folded page from his sketchbook, and placed it in her hand. "For you," he whispered. She unfolded it after he walked away. It was a drawing of two hands, one small, one larger, clasped together. In tiny letters at the bottom, he'd written, "Thank you for being my friend." Tears stung her eyes. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough. And she wasn't going to let him fight this alone. When silence cracks. The house felt colder after Mr. Carter's visit, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Noah noticed it right away. The way Martin's smiles were tighter, his patience thinner, his footsteps heavier on the old wooden floors. Rebecca, usually content to play her part as the gentle caregiver, was quieter too. She spoke to him less, her glances sharper, as if looking at him had become dangerous. She floated through the house like a ghost with a clenched jaw, arms folded across her chest even when she sat down. The worst part wasn't the threats or even the bruises. It was the silence, that sick, stretched silence that filled every room like gas, waiting for the tiniest spark to ignite it. And Noah knew he was the spark. At school, Noah's mask started to slip. It was Olivia who noticed it first, because Olivia always noticed. She saw how his hands shook even when holding something as simple as a pencil, how his eyes flicked to the door at random intervals, like he was waiting for someone to burst in and drag him away. "Are you okay?" she asked for the third time that week. And for the third time, Noah forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said, the lie paper thin. She didn't believe it, but she didn't push. Not yet. Mr. Simmons wasn't doing much better. He had trouble sleeping, his mind circling Noah's confession over and over, replaying those three whispered words. "They hurt me." It wasn't just professional concern, it was personal. The ghosts of his own childhood. The foster homes that weren't safe, the adults who turned a blind eye, stirred restlessly in the corners of his mind. He couldn't be one of those adults. Not again. When Mrs. Anderson updated him after the CPS visit, he felt both relief and frustration. The process was moving, but not fast enough. "They're watching him more closely now," she said, folding her hands on her desk. "But they can't remove him without direct evidence. Without his voice." Mr. Simmons paced the small office. "They're scaring him into silence," he said. "They'd had years to teach him how." Mrs. Anderson sighed. "I know, but unless we can get him to trust us enough to say more, CPS can only do so much." That night, Mr. Simmons lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind kept circling one question. How do you convince a kid to speak when silence has been his only protection? At the Reynolds house, Noah sat on his bed, knees pulled up to his chest, the latest drawing splayed across his lap. He had drawn the house, not the way it looked from the outside, with its clean lawn and cheerful flower boxes, but the way it felt from the inside. The windows were black, the walls covered in invisible hands pressing inward. A tiny boy sat curled in the middle of the floor, his mouth open in a scream that no one could hear. Above him, the ceiling sagged like it was about to cave in. At the bottom, in the corner where no one would notice unless they were really looking, he had scrawled the same three words, "Please save me." He hadn't meant to give Olivia the other drawing. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness where the need to say something outweighed the fear of being found out. But part of him hoped she would see it, really see it. Olivia did. She stared at the drawing for a long time after Noah left it in her hand. The simple image, two hands, one small, one larger, clasped tightly together, spoke louder than words ever could. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she knew it was bad. And she knew Noah needed her, even if he couldn't say it. At dinner that night, she sat at the table, pushing peas around her plate. Her mom, A no-nonsense nurse with a soft heart noticed right away. "Something on your mind, Liv?" Olivia bit her lip. "It's Noah." Her mom set down her fork. "What about him?" Olivia unfolded the drawing, smoothing it flat with her small hands. "I think something's wrong at home." Her mom's expression shifted from curiosity to quiet seriousness. "Has he told you anything?" "No," Olivia admitted, "but he doesn't have to." Her mom took the drawing, studying it for a long time. "I'm going to call the school," she said at last, "just to let them know." "Will that make things worse for him?" Olivia's voice was small. "Not if the right people are watching," her mom promised. The next morning, Mrs. Anderson received Olivia's mom's call, and by lunchtime, she and Mr. Simmons were meeting privately in her office. "She's right," Mrs. Anderson said, holding the drawing Olivia had given her. "This isn't a normal drawing. It's a message." Mr. Simmons' jaw clenched. "He's begging for help the only way he knows how." Mrs. Anderson nodded. "We have to get him somewhere safe. Fast." But fast wasn't fast enough. That afternoon, Martin showed up at the school without warning. His smile was stretched too tight across his face, his eyes hard behind the forced warmth. "I'm here to pick up Noah," he told the front office secretary. The secretary hesitated, fingers hovering over the phone. "I think we need to check with the principal first." Martin's smile didn't change, but the room seemed to shrink around him. "That won't be necessary." The secretary pressed the intercom button anyway. When Mr. Simmons stepped into the office, he felt the tension like a slap. Martin stood with one hand braced on the counter, his knuckles pale, his shoulders too rigid for his forced smile. "Noah's in my care," Martin said, his voice like gravel. "I don't need anyone's permission to take him home." Mr. Simmons crossed his arms. "Actually, you do. There's an open CPS investigation. Until that's resolved, Noah's safety is our priority." For a moment, the two men stood locked in silent combat, neither moving, neither blinking. Martin leaned in, his voice low enough only Mr. Simmons could hear. "You're making a mistake, teacher." Mr. Simmons didn't flinch. "The only mistake I made," he said quietly, "was not asking questions sooner." Behind the office door, Noah stood frozen. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he couldn't help it. He heard every word, every threat disguised as polite conversation. And then he heard something he hadn't expected. Mr. Simmons was fighting for him. For the first time in a long time, someone was standing between him and the danger. The realization felt too big, too impossible to hold. Martin left the school, furious but contained. He knew better than to explode in public. But at home, the mask came off. The door slammed so hard the house shuddered. Rebecca stayed in the kitchen, hands trembling as she wiped the counter for the third time. Martin's voice was low, sharp-edged. "You've been talking to them." Noah stood by the stairs, his heart a drumbeat in his ears. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't. I swear." Martin's fingers twitched. "Liar." Noah bolted. He scrambled up the stairs, the years of silent terror fueling every step. He slammed his bedroom door and shoved his dresser against it, his small body braced against the wood. Martin's footsteps pounded up the stairs after him. "Open this door, boy." Noah's hands trembled so hard he could barely hold the dresser in place. "You think they can save you?" Martin's voice was a snarl. "You think anyone cares enough to keep you?" The pounding stopped. A moment of silence. Then Martin's voice, soft again, too soft. "You open this door, or I break it down." Downstairs, Rebecca's phone rang. She saw the number, CPS. Her heart sank. The cracks in the mask were no longer cracks. They were shattering. Upstairs, Noah backed away from the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His eyes darted to his sketchbook, lying open on his bed. The drawing was still there. The house, the hands, the silent scream. This time, he didn't hide it. This time, he was done hiding. The breaking point. The silence outside Noah's door was far worse than the shouting. Martin's voice, that low, dangerous growl, had stopped after the second threat. What followed was the terrifying quiet that came when Martin was deciding just how bad it was going to be. Noah stood with his back pressed to the dresser he'd shoved against the door, heart slamming so hard against his ribs it felt like it might crack them from the inside. His breath came fast and shallow, the taste of fear bitter on his tongue. The walls of his room seemed to shrink, pressing closer around him. His prison, the place that had once held quiet hope, and now felt like the last place he'd ever see. He had spoken. Even if it was just those 3 words to Mr. Simmons, he had broken the rule. The rule Martin had beaten into him without ever needing to spell it out. You never tell, not to anyone, not ever. And now, the price was coming. A sudden, heavy thud slammed into the door, shaking the dresser. Noah yelped, slapping his hands over his mouth. Another thud, then the doorframe groaned under the pressure. You think I'm playing with you, boy. Martin's voice was still low, but it was no longer calm. It was the voice of a man who'd lost patience, a man deciding between teaching a lesson and delivering a warning. Another crash. This time the door cracked at the edge, wood splintering like bones, snapping under weight. Noah stumbled back, his heels hitting the side of his bed. He grabbed his sketchbook without thinking, clutching it against his chest like a life raft in a storm. His drawings, the ones where his secrets lived, where his silent screams bowled across the pages. They were all he had left. The fourth blow shattered the lock completely. The door swung inward, shoving the dresser aside with a metallic screech. Martin filled the doorway, a dark shape in the dim light of the hallway, his broad shoulders silhouetted like a monster stepping out of a nightmare. Noah froze. His breath caught in his throat like barbed wire. Who do you think you are? Martin's voice was soft again, but that only made it worse. You think they're going to save you. You think anyone cares about a little liar like you. Noah's fingers curled tighter around the sketchbook. He couldn't answer. Martin stepped into the room, every step slow and deliberate. You don't get to ruin this house, he said. You don't get to ruin everything we've done for you. Please, Noah whispered, voice cracking. I'm sorry. Martin's lip curled into something like a smile. You're always sorry. But sorry don't fix nothing. He reached for the sketchbook. Noah yanked it back, panic flooding his chest. That was the wrong answer. Martin's hand shot out, grabbing Noah's wrist so hard the bones ground together. The boy cried out, the sketchbook falling to the floor, pages fanning open, the drawings spilling out like the contents of his mind laid bare. Martin's eyes flicked down, and for the first time, Noah saw it, something close to fear, or maybe rage, flicker across his foster father's face. The drawings told the story Noah couldn't say out loud. Martin's hand, Rebecca's threats, the locked room, the bruises shaped like fingerprints, the terror in Noah's own eyes, captured in shaky pencil lines. You little snake, Martin hissed. You've been making pictures like this. Noah's voice was gone. All he could do was shake his head, though the truth was spread across the floor in black and white. Martin's grip tightened. Downstairs, Rebecca's phone buzzed again. CPS. She had ignored the first 2 calls, her fingers trembling too hard to hit answer. Her perfect life was unraveling, stitch by stitch, undone by the terrified little boy upstairs. And deep down she knew, it wasn't all him. It was the way Martin's temper had grown sharper over the years, the way she had chosen to step back instead of stepping in. It was easier to pretend they were good people than to admit they had let the darkness grow inside their home. The phone buzzed again, insistent, demanding attention. She didn't answer. Noah didn't know how much time had passed since Martin's grip closed around his wrist. It felt like minutes, hours, days compressed into a single stretch of pain and fear. But then the sound came. Heavy knocks at the front door. 3 sharp raps, followed by a voice. Child Protective Services. Open the door. Martin's head snapped up. Noah's stomach lurched, fear and hope tangling into a single jagged knot. The footsteps thundered down the stairs. Martin's heavy boots, followed by Rebecca's lighter, frantic steps. Noah stood frozen, his heart racing so fast it hurt. The front door creaked open. Voices rose, firm and professional on one side, defensive and brittle on the other. Then another voice joined, one Noah hadn't expected. "Mr. Simmons, where's Noah?" That was the first thing Mr. Simmons said when Martin opened the door, flanked by 2 CPS agents and a uniformed police officer. "He's fine," Martin snapped. "This is harassment." "Where is he?" Mr. Simmons repeated, his voice louder this time. Rebecca's voice wavered. He's upstairs." "I want to see him," Mr. Simmons said. "You don't have the right." "We do," the CPS agent cut in smoothly, flashing a court order. "We have authorization for immediate welfare check and potential emergency removal." Martin's face twisted, but even he knew better than to physically block them with a police officer standing there. Noah heard the footsteps coming back up the stairs. He didn't know if they were rescue or punishment. His hand shook so badly he couldn't even gather his sketchbook. He stood in the center of the room, trembling, when Mr. Simmons appeared in the doorway. The teacher's face, usually so calm and kind, was tight with worry. But the relief when he saw Noah standing, breathing, was palpable. "Noah," Mr. Simmons said softly. "It's okay, buddy. We're here." Noah's knees gave out. He sank to the floor, tears slipping down his cheeks as the weight of everything. All the fear, all the silence, all the desperate hope, crashed into him. Mr. Simmons was beside him in an instant, a warm, steady hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now," he whispered. "You're safe." Behind them, Martin stood in the hallway, his face a mask of fury barely held in check. "This is ridiculous," he snarled. "We've done nothing wrong." But the CPS agent was already gathering Noah's things, the sketchbook, the too-thin jacket, the spare clothes folded with care but never worn. "We'll be conducting a full investigation," she said, "and Noah will be placed in protective custody effective immediately." Martin's fists clenched, his face purple with suppressed rage. But no one was looking at him anymore. They were looking at Noah, at the boy whose voice had finally cracked the silence. The ride to the CPS office was silent except for Noah's uneven breathing. Mr. Simmons sat beside him in the back seat, his hand resting near but not on Noah's shoulder, offering comfort without pressure. When they arrived, the caseworker led Noah into a softly lit room with blankets, snacks, and a box of tissues already waiting. It was designed for kids just like him, kids pulled out of darkness into something unfamiliar and terrifying, even if it was safer. Mr. Simmons knelt beside him, voice low. "I'm not going anywhere, okay? You're not alone." Noah clutched his sketchbook tighter. The tears hadn't stopped, but they felt different now. Not fear, not entirely. Some of them were relief. "I'm scared," Noah whispered. "I know," Mr. Simmons said. "But you're brave too." Noah shook his head, unable to believe that just yet. But maybe, just maybe, with someone standing beside him, he wouldn't have to be brave alone. The light beyond the door. The ride to the temporary shelter was long and quiet, the city outside the car windows blurred by Noah's tears. The world felt unreal, like he was drifting outside of his own body, watching some other boy be taken away from a house that had never been a home. He should have felt relieved. Mr. Simmons sat beside him in the back seat, the man's steady presence like a protective wall against the outside world. But relief couldn't quite break through the tangle of fear and guilt wrapped around Noah's chest like thorny vines. What if Martin found him? What if Rebecca lied and said it was all his fault? What if no one believed him after all? The back seat felt too big, too empty, even with Mr. Simmons there. He clutched his sketchbook to his chest, holding it so tightly his fingers turned white. The pages were wrinkled now, smudged with sweat and tears, but they were still the only proof he had of the life he couldn't explain with words. "You okay, buddy?" Mr. Simmons asked softly. Noah's throat was too tight to answer, so he just shook his head. Mr. Simmons didn't push, just sat quietly beside him, like a bodyguard for the space between them. That silence was kinder than the one that had filled his old house. The shelter was warmer than Noah expected. A little rundown, the paint peeling in the hallways and the furniture worn with years of nervous hands gripping the arms of couches. But it was quiet. Not the heavy, dangerous quiet of Martin's house, but a soft quiet, the kind that existed when no one was watching every breath you took. A caseworker named Ms. Patel showed him to his room, a small space with a twin bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a bookshelf, and a plain wooden desk. It was temporary, she explained, just until they could figure out where he would go next. The word temporary made Noah's stomach hurt. Temporary always meant something worse was coming. But when Ms. Patel left, Noah stood in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do with his hands. There were no rules here. No footsteps stomping up the stairs, no voice calling him boy like his name was something Martin refused to learn. He sat on the bed, the sketchbook still clutched in his hands, and for the first time in weeks, he exhaled. Mr. Simmons came back the next day. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He brought a small bag with him, filled with things Noah had never asked for but somehow desperately needed: a set of colored pencils, a notebook with a space-themed cover, and a pack of peanut butter crackers. "I didn't know if you liked peanut butter," Mr. Simmons said, setting the bag on the bed. "But they were my favorite when I was your age." Noah stared at the bag, emotions bubbling up inside him too fast to name. No one had ever brought him things just because. Everything he'd ever been given had been tied to conditions. Be good, be quiet, don't cry, don't make trouble. "These are just for you," Mr. Simmons added, like he could hear the unspoken thoughts. No strings. Noah swallowed hard. "Thank you," he whispered. It felt like too small a word for something so big. Over the next week, Noah started to learn what safe felt like. Safe was a room where no one opened the door without knocking. Safe was a dinner table where no one stared at him, waiting for him to eat too slow or too fast. Safe was Mr. Simmons visiting after school, bringing books from the library, asking about Noah's art without prying into the meanings behind the drawings. Sometimes, safe still felt uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that didn't quite fit yet. His body didn't trust it, his mind still waiting for the floor to drop out from under him. But piece by piece, safe started to settle into his bones. Mrs. Anderson visited too. She brought cookies, the soft kind with powdered sugar on top, and sat cross-legged on the floor of Noah's room, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "We've been working with CPS to find you a foster home," she said gently. "Someplace where you can just be a kid." Noah's stomach twisted. Foster homes meant strangers. It meant new rules, new dangers, new adults with smiles that might be hiding something worse. Mrs. Anderson seemed to sense the fear curling inside him. "You get a say in it," she added. "You're not just being sent somewhere. We're going to find the right place, a good place." He wanted to believe her, but the word home felt like something from a storybook, not something that belonged to him. A week later, Mr. Simmons arrived early, his hands stuffed in his pockets, a nervous smile tugging at the edges of his mouth. "Noah," he said, clearing his throat. I've been thinking." Noah's heart jumped. That sentence never led to anything good. "I was in foster care too," Mr. Simmons said, his voice soft. "I know how scary it is, being shuffled from place to place, never knowing if the next house will be better or worse." Noah's fingers curled into the blanket on his bed. "I talked to CPS," Mr. Simmons went on, "and I asked if maybe you could come stay with me." Noah's breath caught in his throat. "What?" "Not just for a little while," Mr. Simmons said quickly. For as long as you need, as long as you want. The words didn't make sense at first. Teachers didn't take kids home. Teachers were people who disappeared at the end of the day, who waved from classroom doors, but never stepped into the part of life that came after. You mean, live with you? Noah's voice shook. Mr. Simmons knelt so they were eye level. Yeah, buddy, if you want to. Noah's throat burned. He wanted to say yes so badly it hurt, but the fear was still there, clawing at the edges of hope. What if Mr. Simmons changed his mind? What if Noah messed it all up? I'm not perfect, Mr. Simmons said softly, but I got a spare room, and I make a mean spaghetti, and I'd really like to have you there. Noah didn't mean to cry, but the tears came anyway, hot and fast, blurring the edges of the room. Mr. Simmons didn't say anything, just opened his arms, and for the first time, Noah leaned into the hug without hesitation. He didn't say yes. He didn't have to. The first night at Mr. Simmons' house was the quietest night Noah had ever known. The room was small, but the walls were his. The shelves were his. The soft blue blanket and the second-hand rocket lamp. They were his too. There were no footsteps outside the door, no voices rising like thunder beneath the floorboards, just the sound of the house settling, the hum of a distant TV, and the quiet promise of safety wrapped around him like a shield. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Then, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he picked up his pencil and started to draw. Not the house, not the hands, not the fear. He drew a boy. A small boy, standing beside a taller figure, both of them looking at a sky full of stars. He added a house in the background, simple and steady, with lights glowing in every window. And at the bottom of the page, he wrote 3 words, I am safe.